One of the things I think that James does as a book is that it deeply humanizes the character in a way that Huck Finn does but doesn't. I think Percival Everett is much more explicit in that.
Yes.
And in a way, I think the character in Huckleberry Finn is almost like this paternalistic figure, almost like a kind of Uncle Ben type figure that, this young boy learns things from, but he also mistreats in the book.
Hi everyone, this is Laura Yu over at Bookish here with my friends Sylvia and Kofi. This is our first episode after our summer break, so we are going to talk a little bit about how we did with our summer reading plans and then get into a more in-depth discussion about James by Percival Everett. So I'm going to go to Sylvia first.
Ooh.
How did you do with your summer reading?
Okay, so for our listeners who have been listening for a little bit, who've been with us for a little bit, you will know that we have not here over at Bookish had the most successful track record with our summer reading, except for like Laura last year. But, it wasn't the best, you gotta admit, But this year, I think is a little bit different. We set reasonable and realistic goals for ourselves, and I'm happy to report on my end, I made it successfully through all the books I had listed, plus a few extras over the summer. And if you're curious for a full rundown of those books, listen to our previous episode, and we have all those books listed out there for you. I will say the highlight of my summer reading was The Journals of Sacagawea by Deborah Maggie Early, I believe her name is. I can't remember exactly. Summer has been a while ago now. But it was really just unique. And for anyone who is curious, Sacagawea has been like this sort of legend or, a myth, and the more we know about her, the more we know about, the kind of oppressive nature of colonialism, we know that her life was not this kind of glorified life of like traipsing through the North American wilderness, helping Lewis and Clark with a baby strapped to her back. This was a teenager, and she had been sold and suffered horrible abuses. I was not trying to look for that kind of, reading or anything like that, but what really brought me to that novel was that the author, who is from, I think, the same tribe or similar nation, First Nations people, she did just such a beautiful job of bringing that voice out, right? That wasn't condescending, and that was from a distinctly male perspective, right? And that really brought some humanity and I would say even power to this, very human being that we learn about. It's a work of fiction, obviously, but I just thought it was so beautifully done. So yeah, that was my highlight. But how about you, Kofi?
Oh, I have so many highlights. But I have to say that my success rate is not as good as yours. I did read a good deal of stuff. And if I had to say I had a highlight, it would be Nagoski and Nagoski's Burnout, because I was a part of a reading circle. And that was good for me to sort of think through what it means to be in a stress cycle and how to get out of that stress cycle, completing that stress cycle in ways in which enables me to maintain my level of power and control over me, and not try to place power and control over other things that I don't have power and control over. And so it's also understanding how patriarchy impacts women differently than it impacts men, and how in that understanding I can better support women I care about in my life, and even women who will be in my classroom, to understand that not every stressor is going to be, that cycle isn't going to always be worked through simply because I say, hey, you could do it. Because in my positionality, what I think someone can do is oftentimes predicated on my vision of what they can do. Yeah. And that isn't always fair to them. And it's more important to listen. There's a book by Annette LaRue or something like that. I may be butchering her last name, called Listening to People. And it's mostly about doing research and where you're dealing with primary sources, but in that book, it is about just really trying to understand what people are saying in their answers and responses to things, but also in what they're sharing out to you. And so those books taken together were part of the highlights of my reading. And then, I started reading The Parade because I saw that Laura read it, and I started reading it, and I realized I had to read another book that we're going to talk about very soon. But I got into The Parade, and I was like, oh man, I wish we'd done The Parade first because I'm going to finish this one before we get into James. But yeah, I think I read a lot of nonfiction and a lot of more sort of academic adjacent books. Emergent Strategy was another book by Adrienne Marie Brown, which is a really good book. And I read her other book, We Will Not Be Canceled. I think that's what it's titled. And again, it's, what she tries to do is look to nature almost in a sort of Walt Whitman-esque kind of way, but look to nature to understand our nature as human beings and what moves us in a particular way, but also how to overcome trauma through understanding the ways in which nature can inform us in that way. So yeah, I mean, it was doing some heavy reading, some heavy thinking, making some decisions with my life. Trying to be a better human being, and I'm at least about 15 steps away.
But you're one step at a time, right? Getting there.
Oh, yeah. It's more like I get up, I sit down, I get up, I sit down, and that's why it's 15 steps. I never quite make those steps.
So it's not like forward progression steps.
No.
Just like stepping in place.
Yeah, so it's mostly stepping in place. And
yeah.
if my wife was here, it would be like not at all. No steps at all. But no, it's, definitely reading academic adjacent books are a lot different because it can be weighty, but not so weighty that I have to look up, okay, well, who said that? But yeah, it was good. It was good. And, it kind of segues a little bit into James because there are parts in the book where he talks to Rousseau or John Locke and Voltaire.
A lot of French philosophers.
Yeah, a lot of these French philosophers. Yeah. And it's just like, it's a very interesting concept to weave that in.
Yeah.
And how about you?
So I'm going to keep it short because I do want to get to James, but my big reading plan was to read that 800-plus page book called A Little Life. For a book called A Little Life, it's very long. And I would describe it as the best terrible book I've ever read. And I think in some reviews I wrote, it's a book that I would never recommend to a person to read because awful things happen to the main character, and it's a book about 4 friends who are friends from college, but the particular protagonist, I guess, is the main character. I mean, just terrible, awful, horrible things that humans could possibly do to each other happen to him. And it was really hard to hang in there, but I did finish it, and honestly, I think about the book all the time. And I finished it earlier in the summer. And there's this also, because it's such a terrible book, right? Like best terrible book, the way people talk about it on like Book Talk, for example, I feel like I'm part of this little cult or something, club who are traumatized by the book, but who can't stop talking about it or thinking about it and praise it in its own way. So
that should be a future episode topic.
Yeah.
The trauma of books.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And sometimes I have to like hold myself back from gravitating toward those traumatic books. Anyway, so
speaking of, there's plenty of trauma in this book we're talking about.
I wanna talk about James. So now it's been a while since I read it, so I did look up some reviews too to kind of just refresh my memory. But I also read some, generally reviewers like, these major newspapers and magazines, they love the book. But there are also some criticisms, and this might be a good place to start, but I was thinking about that question of, what is the quality of this book, James, as a standalone book? Because it is a book that's responding to, revising, rewriting, whichever verb you want to use, Huck Finn. So I wanted to maybe start there, what you think about that, the book as a book in and of itself, but also as a book that's responding to a different book.
So just for our listeners out there, as Laura mentioned, the book is a response to Twain's Huck Finn, which, is widely read, I think still in a lot of schools, and has itself come under a lot of criticism too for, the use of regionalism, or, kind of the dialect and the racist undertones and overtones in it. And Percival Everett, listeners will know from his book Erasure, which became a wildly popular film that won some Academy Award, right, for something?
I think so, though.
Yeah.
For writing, I think.
Yeah, which, makes sense. But, I think, and that movie's called American Fiction. You guys probably know it as American Fiction. So Everett himself, if you've ever watched American Fiction or read Erasure, you can kind of get a sense of his style and his, I would call it cheekiness, right? When he's writing about life. And in that, I highly recommend folks go back and listen to that episode, because we talk about that book being more than just a book about race, right? And that's sort of like the kind of case in point that he's making, right? James, to your point, Laura, it's a, a response or whatever it is to Huck Finn, and the question you asked about what are its merits as a book in and of itself. Well, we know Percival Everett is an extremely prolific writer. Yeah. It's hard to keep up with his works because he just produces them at such an incredible pace. But I thought that, and it's not the first time, we talked about this before too, that a writer has responded to another major work of fiction. Mm-hmm. So we talk about it with these kind of what I call the pairs, right? So there's Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And, Kofi you brought up the point that Things Fall Apart works beautifully on its own. You don't need to read Heart of Darkness. It can be independent. But I would argue from this critic that says, is it a good book on its own merit? I don't think it's trying to be on its own. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think very much it is grabbing onto Huck Finn and forcing and dragging Huck Finn, that book, right, into conversation with it, and kind of flipping the narrative of it. And the number one clue to that is the title of the book, James, right? Mm-hmm. Because the protagonist, the main character of this book, is Jim, right? The runaway slave Jim that we're introduced to in Huck Finn. But we find out that Jim is not Jim. Well, he is Jim, right? But he's James. And that sort of is the sort of beginning of, within the first few pages, you realize, they are code switching, right? As a means of survival, and also a means of outwitting or outsmarting those who are oppressing them. And just curious what your thoughts were on that, because we talked a little bit about this in our previous episode, the significance of James versus Jim.
Yeah, I think it's also one of the things that, to sort of go back to the initial question and then come and tie it back into what you're saying, Sylvia. I think almost every book is in response to something other, some other writing.
Yes.
And to put the weight on this book that it has to or should be able to stand by itself, well, I don't know if that's necessarily the point of any book, to just stand by itself, because we won't understand it. We have to have some reference points. And I think you can read Huckleberry Finn without reading James, and I think you can read James without reading Huckleberry Finn, because I think the books are trying to do two different things, while at the same time giving an adventure story, giving you this life on the Mississippi River at a particular moment in American history. And I think if I were teaching American Lit, especially in a graduate school situation, I probably would have people read, James and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn to weigh in on what are we being shown in relationship to what the Mississippi represented, the Delta represented, not just for African American history, but also American history as being sort of this blended history. And then why is it that James is bringing in these French philosophers and his moments of delirium or in this sort of waking state or sleeping state? And what is it that Percival Everett is playing with as it relates to Twain? Because Twain, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was a serial, so there's a lot of things that, you got Tom Sawyer comes in and out of all of these different adventures. So it is this young boy's experience with this adult male, and they both are trying to flee something. They're both trying to find themselves in a way that is to some degree, quite patriarchal.
Actually, if you think about the French philosophers that are referenced, like, I kind of had to roll my eyes a little bit because I freaking hate Rousseau, right? Like, I'm like, you... Anyways, so, like, the fact that these people are mentioned, like Locke, I'm okay with, whatever. But I was kind of like, that's an interesting, why the French philosopher? I mean, we can venture to take some guesses, but it was... Yeah.
Those are also, at the same time, examples of like where you might be rolling your eyes, but also chuckling, right? And we talked about this before, how Everett just seems to be this author who must be having so much fun writing these books, right? He is like, I'm going to do whatever I want, and he does, right?
My audience is me.
That's right.
You guys can tag along.
That's right. And so I think that's, and I think there are these moments in the book where the hilarity of some of the situations in the book are really revealing the absurdity of the situation, right? Of especially racism. And so there are these moments that make you laugh out loud, but also like, oh my gosh, this is absurd, this is crazy. Like in the moment when those scenes when he's joining that troupe,
minstrels.
Right? Yeah, the minstrels, for example, and the blackface on the black character who's supposed to be passing for white. And it's just absurd and hilarious. And I think those are the sort of gem or the joys of reading a book like this. And you're right. I think knowing, for example, that apparently I read in an interview that he read Huck Finn 15 times leading up to writing the book or as he was writing the book. So there's a question of like, what is it supposed to be and what is it, obviously. And also Huck Finn is such a, what's the word, like a big cultural...
Iconic.
Yeah, that there are very few... Maybe I shouldn't say that, but you'd imagine there are most people know something about Huck Finn, even if they haven't read it, right? There are movies, there are references to Huck Finn. So it's hard to gauge, like, who is a reader out there who could read James with a blank slate, like with no understanding of Huck Finn. That's hard to imagine. And when you were talking about, like, if you were teaching this in graduate school, what if, like, a bunch of students who never read Huck Finn, what if you had them read James first? And then read Huck Finn,
that would be
right?
an interesting social experiment.
Yeah, I think the other thing about that is that I actually can imagine people not reading.
Yes, now I can.
I absolutely can. And they're first year writing students. They're like, what? Because they may have read excerpts, but they haven't read the entire novel, right? And so that is the thing. Just reading novels that are interconnected with other novels is so not what happens in K-12. And I don't know if it still happens even in undergrad because there's so many different kind of survey classes and you only get an excerpt. I always personally liked Tom Sawyer better. I thought they were better adventures. But Huck Finn became that sort of iconic thing, probably more so in the 20th century than it did in the 19th century. But I have not done a reception study, so I don't know. But, I definitely think what James offers as a book, as I continue to read through, I have not finished. I know how it ends, but I also like to know how it gets there. One of the things I think that James does as a book is that it deeply humanizes the character in a way that Huck Finn does but doesn't. I think Percival Everett is much more explicit in that. And in a way, I think the character in Huckleberry Finn is almost like this paternalistic figure, almost like a kind of Uncle Ben type figure that, this young boy learns things from, but he also mistreats in the book, and in very, very harsh ways in Huckleberry Finn. But, I think that in James, there's some interplay, and it's actually a very, very good book to read. I'm enjoying it. So whoever those critics are. I don't
want to spoil the ending for you, but I will say the ending was just I just enjoyed it so much because there are some things that, so the other night, my husband asked me, we're thinking about watching a movie, right? And he's like, what kind of genre do you want to watch? Like comedy, like action? I said, I want to watch like a non-gory, like revenge film where like the person gets their comeuppance and it's so satisfying, like in just the right way, but it's not like overdone, where this one, I felt the same kind of satisfaction where I was like, take that, and and then the way that the note that it lands on at the end, I just felt was it just felt satisfying to me. You know, it provided what an ending should provide, which is like a sense of closure, but openness too, to like another story somewhere that your brain can imagine is ongoing, but it doesn't close up every loose end, right? So it still leaves that, and so it's not too tidy. But I just thought, you're with him. These are the adventures of Jim. You're with him, or James. You're with him, and you really want to see him achieve what he wants to achieve. And I think the satisfaction comes where like there can be a happy ending for once, you know? It's not always, and most of these books, and again, this episode on trauma and books, I think we should do it, because most of these stories don't end well, right? No. But the fact that he gives, you know, I mean, it's not the most blissfully happy ending, but the fact that he gives us that is almost like, it feels like a gift sometimes to get that. So I wasn't just traumatized. It was good.
So I think talking about the ending, the last... We will put the warning in our description, but basically we're not going to, it's going to be a spoiler because we had talked about the ending. But the last word of the book is James, right? Yes. And having it throughout the novel talked about the issue of names and who is given a name and what kind of names.
And claiming a name.
Yeah, who's called what. And I think just that last line is just James, is him saying just James, that's my name. I think that's very significant.
Because he can, because that's for the first time he's able to like really publicly be who he is privately. Right. And actually, one of my favorite scenes comes towards the end where he and Judge Thatcher, if you remember that character, oh my gosh, they have this interchange. And I just enjoyed that interchange so much because it's like, for the first time, you can tell someone exactly what you're thinking, how you're thinking it, and totally like kind of crush their own misconceived notions about themselves, right? Like you think you're some amazing, benevolent, you know, person. You are the worst of them, you know, because you act nice, but you're just the same as everyone else. And to me, I was like, that's what was like so satisfying, you know, and it just made me kind of be like, you know.
But I also wonder, is that something that is being pointed to in this century? That there are people who are well-intentioned, who believe in their intentionality and wellness and their goodness as symbols of how genuinely concerned they are with the plight of other people, when in fact they are probably the most problematic people.
You mean the benevolent racism that exists in society?
Yeah. It's sort of this like, well, those people are racist, but me, no.
I could never.
I let you in my house through the front door. You know, I don't mind you holding my daughter's hand. You know, it's sort of these sort of virtue signals that I think that he's also poking fun at.
Right.
The cheekiness of Everett. This is what I love.
And even if he's writing in response to or whatever to Huck Finn, he himself, Everett, as an author, has his own audience that he's, even if he's writing for himself alone, he has us. We are the audience in this current time. So just as we often talk about, you know, Twain's writing in his own cultural context, especially in the conversation around the N-word, right? And these books that kind of clean it up or don't clean it up. And I think thinking about obviously the historical context of the book, each of the books, and the audience that they're writing to or for or whoever are expected to be reading these is part of that equation, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's our time.
Oh yeah, I guess we've been on a roll. It should be called butter. So you can we are at the end, and I want to thank all of you who are listening in, and you can catch us at any podcast, whether it's Apple or Spotify or anywhere, or YouTube, and always check in on Facebook because we love to interact with our listeners or viewers. I guess they're listening and thinking, I guess, I don't know. So join us next time for Bookish, a casual book club.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Dragon Podcasts. Connect with us at podbean.com/dragonpodcasts.